Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and you're listening to Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University. Welcome to the first episode of our fall series, where today I'm delighted to talk with Emma Ashford on her new book, First Among Equals, U.S. Foreign Policy in a Multipolar World, which looks at how American foreign policy can best adapt to a changing 21st century.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Emma is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center, where she is part of the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program. She's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and a columnist at Foreign Policy. Let's listen to the conversation. All right, folks, welcome back to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity, and I'm very excited today to be joined by Emma Ashford from the Stimson Center. And Emma and I were talking before we started recording. This is at least her second time on the podcast, maybe third, unclear. But she's just published a new book called First Among Equals, U.S. Foreign Policy in a Multipolar World. And Emma, thanks so much for joining us to talk about it today.
I appreciate you having me on to talk about the book, and it's always fun to talk to folks at Georgetown.
Yes, and you are an adjunct professor here as well. So my fellow Georgetown colleague, Emma Ashford. So let's get into it. As I noted, I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I think you make a lot of strong arguments for the role of America in the world that you envision moving forward. But you also take a lot of time and effort to give people a vision to understand where we need to go. We have to understand where we are. So as you note in the opening of the book, we currently find ourselves in a pivot moment of history. Folks have used the term inflection point, that sort of thing. So what makes this time period so unique when we think about our current world system or a lack thereof, and think about this historically in these types of moments?
So I hate the phrase inflection point with an absolute passion because I think it's overused, just dramatically overused. Everything is an inflection point, a turning point. We're turning the corner in Afghanistan for 20 years. But there is something about this moment. And I talk about it in the book in terms of both where we've been for the last 30 years, that is to say, how the US approached foreign policy during the unipolar moment. And I talk a little bit about how it's very transformative, kind of crusading foreign policy and the failures of that foreign policy. So that's one component of this. But then the other part is trend lines, right? Looking at the ways in which the broader world is changing. States are more powerful. China's the most obvious example, but a variety of other sort of middle states are rising. The United States is not in absolute decline, but these states are rising to meet us. Because of these changing trends, we're in one of these periods of flux in international order and in US foreign policy that means we have to have the debates again about how we proceed from here. And so, I would draw parallels with maybe the 1970s or the 1930s or the 1890s, right? These periods where changing world environment meant that policymakers started to have these debates about how do we proceed.
Yeah, and maybe for a whole nother podcast, but I'm teaching a class right now on America's 1930s, in part because there's been so many analogies to today in the 1930s, so I wanted to kind of interrogate that. But getting back on point, you mentioned the unipolar moment, and that moment in international order and America's history setting the stage for the past 30 years of foreign policy in the United States. And it's important to understand what that was and what it meant and what policies came out of that so that we can kind of understand what's different about today and what needs to change and maybe what doesn't moving forward. So can you explain a little bit what was the unipolar moment? And I think we'll talk about this as we go through the book. A lot of folks in Washington still act as if the U.S. remains in a unipolar moment, and that obviously has large correlations to what they envision our role in the world to be. So let's unpack that a little bit, the unipolar moment.
Yeah, I mean, look, so Charles Krauthammer coined the phrase in Foreign Affairs in like 1992, 93, something like that. The unipolar moment is quite simply this moment after the fall of the Soviet Union, where the United States is left, Krauthammer says, this standing alone above the world, right? So the US is the only remaining superpower. And for the next 20 to 30 years, the US can pretty much do what it wants in the world because there's really no other country that can challenge it. One of the more interesting things about the current moment is I've been working in DC for 10 or 12 years at this point. When I arrived in DC, many of the debates were about the war on terror and where should the US be intervening and humanitarian intervention, all of these things. But those debates were basically grounded in, the unipolar moment still existed at that point. The US was still really far out ahead of the pack. And to the extent that people were worried about things like China, it was sort of a lesser concern. I think now, in the mid 2020s, what we're seeing is the unipolar moment is either over or is almost over, right? We're seeing this very changed global environment. And the debates that we're seeing in the foreign policy community are responding to that, right? So instead of a debate about whether the United States should maintain its liberal order and its troops overseas, those debates are no longer framed in terms of, is this a responsibility of the United States or is it too costly? Now they're framed in terms of, can we afford to keep doing this? Is US presence in Europe distracting us from the things that we need to do in Asia? The trade-offs have become much more explicit. And to me, that implies that we have left this moment of US kind of overweening predominance.
Yeah, and you alluded to it already in your opening comments to my first question, but if we're not in that unipolar moment, and I want to reiterate, very much appreciate how you note throughout the book that how important it is to understand the world as it is. I actually just did a review of Steve Cook's new book on the Middle East, End of Ambition, I think that's called. And he hammers that home as well. Like, your starting point should always be viewing the world as it is when you're then creating strategy and policy coming out of that. And oftentimes I think we kind of overlook that part when we're thinking about what we're trying to do or should be doing in the world. So when viewing the world as it is, how do you see the current world system as we're either out of the unipolar moment, moving out of it? What do you describe in the book as to what we're moving into?
So I make the argument in the book that we're moving into what I would say unbalanced multipolarity, right? There's been academic debates about what polarity is. A lot of people think multipolarity has to be perfectly balanced between 3, 4, 5 countries, but actually much of the time in history, it's basically one or two major powers, superpowers, and a bunch of middle powers under them. Schweller, I think, describes them, Randall Schweller, as middle rank great powers or second tier great powers, and then everybody else. And so to me, that is kind of the world that I see emerging. And actually, your comment about Steve Cook's book, I think, provides me a really great anecdote on this, which is Steve and I were on this trip last year to Saudi Arabia with a bunch of folks from the Council on Foreign Relations. And in the Gulf, one of the things that we do see is, I think, just how a more multipolar world is going to feel, right? You go to Riyadh, you go to Dubai and the United Arab Emirates, and what you see is Chinese companies building all these fancy new buildings, Gulf money supporting different charitable projects or aid projects. You see global sports coming into the Gulf in ways where they were predominantly in Europe or the US before. And you see European companies providing the engineering know-how for some of these projects and Americans on the security side. And to me, the Gulf is just a fascinating example of one of the places where we see countries they're not as big and powerful as the United States or China or even the Russians, but they influence things on the global stage. And these are the countries that the US, China, and others are going to have to work with as we move forward into this era. So I actually think that that's a pretty good example for this world.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a really good microcosm of the world writ large. I just think I saw today or yesterday that Tom Brady's going to go play flag football in Saudi Arabia. So, to your point about sports, one of the good things that I think you do extremely well for the rest of us folks, and you've done in multiple other things that you've written over the years, is sort of identify the different schools of thought out there and kind of explain those to people. And you do that in this book again. And I think it's fantastic. And you name four main schools that you talk about that are out there that have visions of what America's role should be in the world and how we should go about getting to these ends. So, what are those four? And give us a quick little synopsis of what each one of those stands for.
This chapter really grew out of my own anthropological curiosity about the people around me in Washington, right? Because I interact with a lot of people with very different opinions on a regular basis. And I think there's this tendency, maybe because of post-Cold War strategic debates, to see this debate as a sort of America in or America out. And actually, the cleavages between the different groups and different opinions out there are much more numerous and create some very interesting dynamics. There are lots of things that aren't just about US military posture overseas that differentiate some of these arguments in Washington. So I pull out kind of four main groups of folks. The first one would be well represented by the Biden administration, right? Classic liberal internationalists, but they've sort of given up on some of the humanitarian intervention, nation building part of the unipolar moment, but still very committed to liberal order, to US military primacy in this world. A second group, America First folks, right? Jacksonian Republicans. Again, perhaps best represented by the Trump administration, but not only. Focused on the national interest rather than the notion of liberal order, very focused on sovereignty, care a lot about things that we typically pulled out of foreign policy, even if maybe we shouldn't have. So immigration, trade, these things. So that's the first two groups. And I think both of those are very well represented in the policy world. And then I have two more groups that I think are somewhat more marginalized, but still involved in this debate. One that I belong to would be restrainers or realists, who, again, tend not to be as partisan as some of the other groups, but are looking for a slimmed down US military involvement in the world. And then the progressives, who also want a slimmed down US military presence in the world, but match that to some really expansive internationalist humanitarian goals. And that's, to me, also an interesting conversation that we see happening up on Capitol Hill with some of the progressive caucus.
Yeah. And would you say, I mean, I know the Trump administration is still in power right now, but who do you see as having the most influence right now? Is it still the liberal internationalists because of just the long held belief in that, or is it shifting?
This administration is really interesting. And I mean, obviously, as with all books, right, much of this book was written actually before Biden dropped out of the race last year. So a lot has happened in that time. I do think we've seen both the sort of America First nationalists and the restrainers have gained substantially more influence over the policy process than they had even a year ago. In Washington, across think tanks, we still see a liberal internationalist consensus, but I think it's increasingly a question, how much influence many of them have on policy, particularly in this administration. And then the last point that I'll sort of make here is I don't know where the Democratic Party is going on foreign policy. I think there's the old bipartisan consensus. There's the progressive visions, which are quite poorly fleshed out in many ways, even if there's a lot of energy behind them. And there's just a debate. I don't think Democrats really know where they want to go in foreign policy. They just know that what Biden did didn't work.
Right. And they don't want to be America First hawks.
Exactly. But at the same time, if the electorate wants, let's say, nationalist, but not necessarily in the Trump administration sense, right? If the American public likes the notion of American interests first, can Democrats find a softer edged version of that? I think is a really interesting question.
Yeah, and that's something we'll be watching and seeing in real time over the next couple of years, which will be interesting. So you propose a realist internationalism for the U.S. moving forward. And we'll get into some of the specifics of that in a few minutes, but you mentioned a few main tenets of that strategy. Can you tell us what those are?
Yeah, so as you say, the back sort of third of the book is basically my prescription for what the United States should do when faced with this emerging world. And I didn't want to write something that was a new fancy strategy of, I don't know, networked politics or something like that, which is not to say that these books on grand strategy are not good sometimes, but I think there's this tendency to invent the wheel again and try and find something new and innovative. Instead, I'm talking about a return to a more realist approach to foreign policy. And that is not realist necessarily in the neo-realist, structural realist sense, but if I might just pull on my own sort of Presbyterian background here, like ecumenical realism. So a broad realism of the kind that we've seen from George Washington through Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon and on, that basically says, right, US interests are more limited than they have been in the last 30 years. It's mostly about security and prosperity for the American people. We should be wary of treating things like alliances as ends rather than means. And we need to think about how to bring means and ends in alignment in US foreign policy. And those, again, back to that 30-year period, I think that is probably the biggest problem facing policymakers today is we embraced incredibly expansive aims, and we're now so over-leveraged that dialing back is a real difficulty.
Yeah, well, and that's always hard for Americans to do, right? The history of the U.S. is something's not working, we create a new entity to deal with that instead of reforming or getting rid of the old entity. We just put the new one side by side. You mentioned a couple specific areas on the policies that the U.S. should put in place to go after this larger strategy, and one of those is Europe. And this has been discussed a lot lately on the U.S.'s role in Europe. So what does your strategy entail for the U.S. doing in Europe specifically?
Just to actually make the point on how much the last year has changed things, when I wrote this chapter on Europe, I was worried it would be absurdly radical and potentially get me cancelled in Washington. It is now more moderate than the US government position on Europe. And that is, so the shift in politics towards Europe has been extremely fast and extremely dramatic. But the point that I make in the book, and that I think still holds up, is that this change has been coming for a very long time. And for US policymakers, the problem has been, going back to Obama and beyond, how do you dial down your presence in Europe in order to focus elsewhere? How do you convince Europeans you're serious about it in ways where they step up and you're not left with either some sudden withdrawal that leaves Europe vulnerable, or you're not left stuck there forever? And so in the book, what I propose is, a phased approach to this, right? Being very clear about when and where and what the US intends to pull back from Europe over a 5 to 15-year period that allows for the burden to transfer, to shift to European countries. Now, again, that actually sounds somewhat moderate by the standards of the moment, but I think it's still the best approach because it allows for that time that the Europeans need. You can't just create a defense industrial base from scratch overnight, but it also allows for the US to start transferring some of that burden pretty fast. There are things that can be turned over fast, and we should move in that direction with some speed.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting, you note that it now seems like a fairly moderate position compared to some of the administration since you wrote this, but it is also fairly forward-leaning on what has been the historical role of the U.S. in NATO and in Europe. And I think it's worth highlighting again, as a U.S. diplomatic historian, I appreciate that you're pointing out that Trump's call for more burden sharing on the side of the allies isn't something new. I mean, he might fudge where that money goes, and they don't owe it to the United States, but this is something that harkens back to Eisenhower and Kennedy of saying that you guys got to pay more money for your defense here. So I think that's moving forward on that is something there's a historical record of the U.S. wanting that to happen. It's beneficial for the United States. And it's just that political willingness to do that and take the actual concrete steps that then force the Europeans to say, oh, they're actually doing this. We do need to create this defense and internal domestic production for defensive goods and things like that. And I don't know if you saw it or not, but I did see either today or yesterday, I think it was the Dutch that turned down buying the U.S. planes and are going to buy European-made. So that's, I would imagine, a good sign towards something like that. So we'll see what happens with that. And you also have specific policy recommendations for Asia as well. And this speaks to why you think we should have somewhat of a drawdown in Europe. So talk to us about the importance of Asia and the policy you would like to see implemented there.
Yeah, so in the book, I kind of split this into two chapters, right? I have a chapter that's pullback, and that's Europe and the Middle East. And we don't need to talk about the Middle East anymore. We've talked about that plenty in the last 30 years. But then there's a lean in chapter, and that's the Indo-Pacific, and that's economic statecraft and trade. From my point of view, I think we underleverage both of those and we need to emphasize them more. The reason why the United States cares and should care about the Indo-Pacific is because it is a fast-growing region, it is economically vibrant, it is the place where much of our trade happens, the place where we interact with other countries on a regular basis. And so I say we should be leaning in. That doesn't necessarily mean military buildup in the region. The United States, I think, needs some reforms to its posture in the region. There's places like South Korea where it doesn't make as much sense as it used to. There's places like the Philippines or elsewhere where we might be underleveraged. But I tend to see this mostly as a diplomatic and economic strategy of engagement, because the one true threat that the United States faces to our, maybe not necessarily to our security here at home, but to our prosperity, to the ability of Americans to live the lives that they want to lead, that's China. China's ability to exclude us from the region. And so I want to see the US remain a very active player in the Indo-Pacific going forward.
So for a lot of folks in DC that do policy, and we talked about sort of the entrenched role that liberal internationalists play in the US over the past 80 years, and especially the last 30, there's going to be, or there are folks that sort of push back against this and have a different vision of America. So you talk a little bit in the book too about and go ahead and answer some possible critiques. So what are some of those critiques that you sort of highlighted in the book, and how do you address those?
So I think it's really important to be clear that this is not a strategy without trade-offs. There aren't strategies that have no trade-offs, and anyone that pretends otherwise is telling you a lie. Let me highlight just a couple of the places where I think there are very clear alternatives to what I'm talking about. So I think one is, I advocate in the book that the US should really lean into multipolarity, to think about ways to shift the burden to regional states, to have a more flexible posture where we're not necessarily tied by alliances to specific commitments everywhere around the world, the flexibility to work with countries that are not allies, that are adversaries or neutral or, somewhere in the middle. I want the US to operate flexibly in what I see as this emerging world. I think that contrasts very strongly with the Biden administration's approach, where you will find folks who argue that the US must build some alliance, whether this is military, techno-industrial, whatever it is, in order to combat the growing alignment of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, this axis of upheaval, I think is the phrase that's commonly used. I tend to think that the flexible approach is the better one, because I don't really see a lot of commonalities between that axis, other than the fact that the US has been helping to push them together in many ways. So that's sort of one area where I think my book has a real contrast with some of the current arguments in DC. Another flaw of the strategy, or problem with the strategy, is it creates trade-offs, particularly in the nuclear space. If the US shifts the burden to some of its allies, I think the probability is there will be some limited nuclear proliferation. Now, I suspect that it will be a small number of countries, because proliferation is still going to be viewed very negatively. It's only going to be a small fraction of countries that want to go down that road. But I think that might be the trade-off that the United States has to accept in exchange for not ourselves bearing all the risk of a nuclear umbrella for the whole world in an era of great power competition. But that, again, I talk about it in the book because I think that's one of those areas where reasonable people can disagree, and it would be good to have more of a debate explicitly on this point in the foreign policy community.
Yeah, because you don't see it as inherently dangerous as some do.
Yeah, so US policy has for decades, going back before the unipolar moment, has been to discourage nuclear proliferation. There have been times when we have not prevented it among allies, and there have been times where we've successfully dissuaded. For example, the South Koreans previously went down this road and we managed to pull them back from it. I don't think nuclear proliferation is a good thing. I certainly don't side with Ken Waltz in that Waltz-Sagan debate. We can still have accidents. Nuclear weapons are inherently dangerous. People can miscalculate. But neither do I think that the extreme position we've come to in Washington over the last 30 years is accurate. This notion that any nuclear proliferation, preventing it, is worth bearing any price, right? Whether that is invading Iraq toppling a government in Libya, whether that is trying to prevent other countries from even considering it by maintaining, as I say, 60,000 troops in South Korea. To me, that is a trade-off. It's not something where there's necessarily an absolute good in preventing proliferation.
So these longer-term strategic talks and discussions are difficult to have, especially because people are tied to their viewpoints. And while I view some of this as a historian, I would remind people that the last 80 years has kind of been the outlier in U.S. history as far as our role in the world and the view we had of the world. But, people are really tied to these strategic beliefs and the role they think the U.S. should play in the world. We also have a government and a system that's got 2- and 4-year election cycles, and it's hard to think beyond that. What are some of the takeaways you would like policymakers to get from this, and how do we try to get that discussion more in line with what's going on with election cycles and trying to, actually take hold?
To me, this is actually one of the benefits of the strategy that I'm proposing, is that there are areas like a phased withdrawal from Europe where some continuity over administrations is probably necessary, certainly would be helpful. But the more kind of flexible approach that I'm suggesting, I think, is less dependent on consistency across 15 or 20 years of administrations than many of the other strategies that are out there at the moment. If you look at some of the proposals for allied scale as a US strategy, right? So we build a defense industrial complex that spans the US and its allies, and we use that build up to counter China. That's a very activist, hands-on, constant management policy that requires a lot of continuity and commitment between administrations. And so, again, for me, that the more flexible approach seems to me to be a little bit more adaptable as we see administrations where, again, they may not have settled views on foreign policy because we're in this period of flux. And so I worry whenever I see a really ambitious grand strategy that we are going to reshape the world or the US and its allies into some shape, and that will help us win, the next Cold War against China. I wonder if that's something we can genuinely accomplish. Maybe something less ambitious might be the way to not have everything fail and fall down around us.
Fair enough. All right, before I let you get out of here, you also mentioned, for those folks that are interested to read more about these different viewpoints on America's role in the world, you said that your folks at the Stimson Center are about to publish something. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so this week we actually published, think of it a bit like a companion to the book, which is in the one chapter we talked about earlier. I talk about these various viewpoints on foreign policy, and I thought as I was going through that, I was like, wouldn't it be nice to have a set of essays or something that collects some of these viewpoints? And so we did that. So it's called New Visions and Grand Strategy. We've got 10 essays from folks that are thoughtful, out-of-the-box thinkers from across the political spectrum. We have conservative nationalists, we have progressives, we've got traditional liberal internationalists, we've got American unilateralists, all writing about sort of what they think the world looks like and where they think the US should go from here. So there's a volume of essays on the Stimson website, and there's also a podcast series called The Strategy Sessions that's interviews with each author and me and them discussing their essays. And so I think if folks are interested in my book, they'll almost certainly be interested in this set of essays. And again, I think it does a little bit to flesh out. I can look at what's going on in DC and I can say, hey, this is what's happening. But it's really nice to be able to have others flesh out their own opinions and draw out some of the contrasts in comparison.
Emma, as always, I appreciate it. And thanks for coming on.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks again to Emma for her time and thoughts. And thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Immunity. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Abdullah Nassif. Thanks to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GU Diplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.